Let me begin with a simple observation. Many schools open with strong design intentions, openness, collaboration, flexibility, transparency. But then school life begins, noise travels, movements become distracting, supervision becomes complicated. Some students thrive, others feel exposed, teachers improvise, leaders respond. At that point, change begins. A wall's added, a breakout area is repurposed, furniture is shifted to regulate attention. These are often treated as practical adjustments, but they're much more than that. They're pedagogical and organisational acts. They are respatialisation. They show that school space is never merely occupied, it's continually remade. This talk about respatialisation is based on a co-authored article with Annelie Frellin and Jan Granis, and I want to acknowledge from the outset that this way of thinking about respatialisation has been shaped through our collaboration. I'm Jennifer Charteris. I'm a New Zealander and I live in the tablelands of the New England in New South Wales, Australia. Most of my professional life has been as an educator in New Zealand. These maps show where my university is in Australia and the Aotearoa New Zealand research context that I'm going to talk about today. New school buildings are often presented as pedagogical solutions. However, let's think about them as propositions, material propositions about how teaching, learning, movement, collaboration, visibility, and identity ought to occur. The key question is what happens when those propositions meet the realities of school life. Think of one new or refurbished school space you know well. What changed when teachers and students commenced using it? What did that change reveal about the use of space? In my previous visit to Iceland in 2024, I was left with a lasting impression of innovation and community, and with a question that stayed with me. What do we learn about school buildings once school life begins? That question feels especially pertinent in a Nordic context where research on school environments has taken the relationship between architecture, public purpose, and everyday educational practice seriously. New and refurnished school buildings are often shaped by uncertainty. As we know, they're designed for an unforeseen future, so they carry both aspiration and risk. They're intended to drive change in teaching and learning, yet the literature shows that misalignment often emerges between architectural design and everyday pedagogy. That's why practitioner involvement in planning and co-design is so important. Teachers and leaders understand how movement, supervision, collaboration and care actually unfold in practice. We know that as they're inhabited, learning environments are reshaped by users over time. As the Finnish Healthy Schools report illustrates, education departments can be stronger at planning and constructing buildings than at learning from them once they're inhabited. Post-occupancy evaluation can be uneven, and feedback into future projects isn't always embedded. That means important lessons about how spaces work in practice can be lost. Space is not fixed. Space emerges through relationships, routines, and everyday educational practices. Flexibility is therefore not just a design feature. It depends on how space is used, negotiated, and adapted over time. It's continuously made and remade. If space is socially produced, if misalignments are common, and if post-occupancy learning is limited, then it becomes necessary to focus on what happens after buildings are inhabited. Respatialisation names this ongoing work. When schools adjust, reinterpret, and redesign their environments so that pedagogy, organisation and well-being remain in workable alignment over time, respatialisation names the ongoing work. I find the idea of respatialisation useful. I'm not using it broadly to mean that buildings change with use over time. That would be too obvious. I'm using it to name the more specific work that educators do when they engage with design intentions, built policy, and everyday educational practice, and when these alignments aren't fully realised. In that sense, respatialisation is not simply a retrofit or a tweak of built spaces. It's a form of educational judgment where real educational life of architecture begins. As many of you may be aware, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the political focus on new learning environments has been a forced choice. Between September 2010 and the end of 2011, 4 major earthquakes and more than 11,200 aftershocks shook the residents of Christchurch and surrounding towns. The quake in February 2011 had a magnitude of 6.3 and killed 185 people and injured several thousand. With investment, it was an opportunity to rethink the approach to pedagogy and its interplay with schooling spaces. There emerged a period of major rebuilding and refurbishment, especially in Greater Christchurch, and in response to leaky buildings across the country. There was also mould, which had an impact on the changes in school buildings. These conditions produced not only new buildings, but also expectations about pedagogy. Large, flexible spaces designed for co-teaching, learner agency, collaboration, and digital integration became material expressions of future-focused schooling. Yet once occupied, the spaces didn't simply deliver transformation. They had to be interpreted, managed, negotiated, and in many cases modified in relation to the practical realities of teaching and learning. I'm going to talk about some examples from a qualitative case study where Jan Granis and Annelie Frelin and I undertook abductive analysis and used Massey's space theory and Wenger's community of practice to think about respatialisation. Across the data, a few linked themes really stood out. The first was physical adaptation and spatial reconfiguration. Walls were added and removed to make spaces work better. There was pedagogical alignment. Spaces were reshaped to support collaboration, small group teaching and more focused learning. There was dynamic socio-spatial negotiation because teachers and students were constantly working out how shared areas, breakout spaces and hubs would actually be used day to day. We also saw functional multiplicity with the same space taking on different roles at different times. There was spatial flexibility and future-proofing as schools kept adjusting spaces in response to changing pedagogies, student needs and policy settings. Safety and well-being came through strongly too, especially around acoustics, visibility, supervision and how students were grouped. And there was identity transformation as teachers and students moved away from the idea of one person owning one classroom and more towards shared use of space, even though that could create pressure for some people. The next themes were really about how this work gets carried forward. Community and stakeholder participation matters because these decisions are shaped and sometimes limited by who is involved. This work is also iterative and reflective. Schools design and review and question and adapt over time. We also saw a strong focus on flow and circulation, on how people move through spaces, and on acoustic and sensory management, often in response to noise and the need of neurodiverse learners. More broadly, this points to a process of policy borrowing and local adaptation. Schools inherited design ideas shaped by policy, but they reworked them in local ways. This is where socio-spatial relationality matters, because space is produced through everyday interactions. And responsive leadership is central to that process because leaders are often the ones noticing issues, coordinating change, and helping keep space aligned with teaching and learning. Taken together, these themes show that respatialisation is not a one-off fix. It's an ongoing collective process. So let's look at a couple of examples. We begin with Tideflow School, which opened in 2020 in response to rapid growth in its local area. Principal Craig described the school as a space that had to be argued with almost from the moment that it opened. There was tension between design and educational use, which sits at the centre of his narrative. Two features became symbols of that misalignment. The first were tiny enclosed reading spaces that staff called jails. These had been designed as quiet withdrawal areas, but in practice, Craig believed they were too small to be useful and too prescriptive in how they imagined reading would happen. Craig's point is not only that they failed functionally, it's that they imposed a spatial story that didn't hold up to practice. The second feature was a set of grandstands built into the middle of the learning areas. These were visually dramatic, but for staff they consumed valuable teaching space and introduced obstruction rather than possibility. So Craig's response was subtractive. He removed the jails and removed some of the grandstands as well. This redesign was not about correcting teachers so they fit the bill better. He framed spatialisation as ongoing work, working with the governance body, the Board of Trustees, engaging community, checking changes against the strategic direction of the school, and evaluating evidence along the way. In the tide flow case, respatialisation took the form of refusal, subtraction, and collective review. Bellerophon School is a rebuilt full primary school that's experienced substantial role growth. The building opened in 2014 with a second stage added in 2020. Like many schools of its kind, it was designed around large open spaces with breakout spaces and shared teaching possibilities. Josh's account doesn't centre on awkward features that can simply be removed. His challenge is that the openness is fixed, but the building wasn't easily subdivided. It was difficult to insert walls or structurally reshape the larger spaces, so this issue was inflexible openness. The building implies adaptability while limiting the means by which the adaptability could be materially achieved. Josh describes how teachers made the space workable through zoning. One part of a larger area became a community zone, another became a teaching zone, and breakout spaces were used depending on the size and needs of the cohort. In other words, the differentiation of space was enacted rather than built. It depended on coordination between teachers, timing of activities, and an active management of overlap. Josh was very clear that this is easier with fewer students. However, with cohorts of larger students, the same physical space began to function differently. Teachers started competing for control over the same area, and there was a risk of interference between activities. What this case makes visible is that spatial capacity is never just a matter of square metres. It's produced through the relation between activities, bodies, and professional coordination. A second part of Josh's story concerns the material conditions of learning. He reflected on how flexibility was interpreted through quite loose arrangements, with children sitting on floors, under tables, or using improvised surfaces. Over time, this was reconsidered. Tables and defined working areas were reintroduced because staff came to view that teachers needed stable surfaces and dependable working positions to support strong learning outcomes. They linked the use of space with student learning outcomes. Here, respatialisation involves reintroducing material stability into an open environment. It was not a retreat from space or the openness of it. It was a recalibration grounded in what teachers observed about learning, attention, and the everyday work of the classroom. In Bellerophon, respatialisation is less visible as construction and more visible as choreography, the ongoing production of workable zones, rhythms, and material supports inside an architecture that cannot easily be remade. Central Primary School brings yet another variation. Principal Winona leads an urban primary school that was renovated and extended in 2018. It is urban and multi-storied, and I'm talking about changes since then. What is striking is that Winona didn't begin with teacher adaptation, but with spatial diagnosis. diagnosis. She didn't assume that the environment's basically right and that people simply need to use it better. Instead, she studied what the space was actually doing. She used observational tools, including stop-motion cameras, to analyse movement and flow through the school. She looked for friction points, for places where circulation was breaking down, where sightlines worked against teaching, where people were pulled into awkward patterns of occupation. This provides an account of a school trying to read itself spatially. In one 3-teacher area, the issue was orientation. Teachers were positioned with their backs to what she described as the wrong walls, and breakout areas were too small or too poorly located to be genuinely useful. Her response wasn't large-scale rebuilding. It was to reconfigure walls, improve flow, widen circulation, and redirect sightlines toward more workable and better lit orientations. These are relatively modest interventions, but the point is that small spatial changes can reorganise the social life of a room. The changes affect how movement happens, how interruptions occur, and how student attention is sustained. The second part of Winina's account is of how spatialisation concerns acoustics and sensory conditions. Hard materials such as concrete, steel and cabinetry had produced an environment in which sound bounced and accumulated, so the school added acoustic treatment and removed reflective and obstructive elements. Here, respatialisation is about atmosphere, sensory load, and the conditions under which a space becomes bearable, inclusive, and educationally productive. Winona also places this work in time. She noted that what may have worked some years earlier no longer worked in the present, given changing pedagogies, changing student needs, and the altered experiences of post-pandemic schooling. In her case, respatialisation appears as iterative calibration, reading the school closely, making practical adjustments, and recognising that there's no final state of perfect alignment. Taken together, these 3 schools show models of respatialisation. Craig's school worked through subtraction, Josh's through choreography under constraint, Winona's through diagnosis and calibration. What joins them is that occupation itself generates knowledge. Once school life begins, buildings disclose their frictions and excesses, blind spots, and unrealised possibilities. Respatialisation is the ongoing work educators do with that knowledge. So with these cases in mind, I want to turn now to the policy edge of this work. In the New Zealand context, school space is being repoliticised. We're seeing a shift from the language of innovation and flexibility towards the language of standardisation, efficiency, consistency, and control. Rewalling in this context is becoming more than a local design response. It's being positioned as a visible corrective to the open plan agendas of the recent past. The issue is not simply whether walls are better. The deeper issue is how spatial change is being used to settle wider ideological arguments about pedagogy, professionalism, and the purposes of schooling. That means respatialisation is not inherently progressive or regressive. It can be locally intelligent response to pedagogical need, and it can be mobilised as a political symbol in wider struggles over educational authority, standardisation, and reform. What these examples suggest is that innovative learning environments succeed through ongoing adaptation. It's not about assigning blame, neither criticising designers for impractical layouts, nor teachers for a perceived reluctance to adapt. Rather, spatialisation and the spatial configurations of school buildings are always in process and necessarily a multiplicity embedded in schooling relations as sites of connection and communities of practice. So let's finish with the last few points. Design isn't destiny. Educational value emerges through use, critique, and adaptation. Respatialisation is educational judgment in material form. Adding walls, removing features, rezoning spaces and adjusting acoustics are not minor fixes. They're decisions about pedagogy, inclusion, attention, safety and belonging. Habitation generates knowledge. Schools learn about buildings only once people begin inhabiting them. Frictions, blind spots and possibilities become visible through everyday use. Flexibility is organisational as well as architectural. What counts as a flexible environment depends on movement, coordination, cohort size, routines, furniture and teacher collaboration, as well as purposeful designs. Reviews should be a core leadership practice. Our study suggests that schools need systematic ways to observe use, gather feedback, and refine spaces over time, because adaptation is where educational environments become fit for purpose. Built policy is always localised in practice. Schools inherit design ideas shaped by wider policy agendas, but leaders and communities still have to reinterpret them in relation to local pedagogical realities, as we know. Much of this is really obvious, and this corresponds with work undertaken across Nordic countries. Buildings as built policy are continually reinterpreted in practice. Respatialisation reframes the relationship between space and pedagogy, and that, finally, is why respatialisation matters. It's not evidence that innovation has failed. It's evidence that educational space remains a living, contested and practice-dependent achievement.